Welcome to ONS Energy Talk. My name is Ingvild Meland and I'm the Program Director of the ONS Foundation. Today we will talk about cybersecurity, digitalization, smart grids, smart devices. It might make the energy industry more an attractive target for cyber attacks. But how can we manage this? Manage the risk, and even more important, how can we make the businesses become cyber resilient? To help us understand this topic, we have with us a global authority on this. He has a long and distinguished career within the US Air Force. He's been working and has long experience from the Pentagon, and he has previously also held a role as Director of Operation as a US Cyber Command. Now he's actually the co-founder and COO of a company called IronNet Cybersecurity. Major General Brett Williams, welcome so much to you.
Hi, Ingvild. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here today with you. I'm just very sorry I won't get to meet you in person in September as we planned, but maybe we can do it next year.
That's a plan. That's for sure a plan. Things can happen, and we've all experienced that these days.
Yes, that's for sure.
But just General Williams, I need to know your story. You're coming from the US Cyber Command, and you left the military and you founded the IronNet company. Could you elaborate a little bit on what kind of demands you saw within the cybersecurity space and how you're now working to meet those demands?
Yeah, absolutely. Our company was founded, and our chairman and CEO is a gentleman named retired General Keith Alexander. And General Alexander was the director of the National Security Agency here in the United States, and he was also the first commander of United States Cyber Command. We activated Cyber Command in about 2009 when as the US, we realized that there was definitely a strategic threat to the United States in cyberspace, and that just as our military is responsible for defending in the air, on the land, at sea, there needed to be a Department of Defense component to defend in cyberspace. And so General Alexander was the first commander, and in my last position on active duty, as you indicated, I was his director of operations, so I worked directly for him. So we both retired about the same time in 2014, and we founded IronNet Cybersecurity. And our objective has really been to continue the mission, if you will. We are very passionate about helping companies, business sectors, and nations think differently about cybersecurity. And our approach and our consulting work and the services we offer are all oriented on two things. Number one is the concept of collective defense. We believe there's a major challenge the way most of us approach cybersecurity, where each company tries to defend itself alone. We have to be able to get companies that are like-minded, that are in the same supply chain, that are same business sector, to be very proactive at sharing information and getting to a collective defense arrangement. Just like the reason we formed NATO was for collective defense. We're all stronger together. We need the same thing in cybersecurity. The second component of that is, and I've read some articles in the Norwegian press, it's a very similar emphasis in Norway about this need to have a public-private partnership and be able to share information between the public sector and the private sector to defend ourselves. So fundamentally, it's about this collective defense approach, company sectors, nations, public-private sharing and cooperation. And then the second level is what we saw, because we saw many advanced threats, is that the reasons a lot of our cyber defenses fail today is we rely on what's called signatures. We've seen a certain type of attack. We program that attack into our firewalls and other systems. And as long as the attacker doesn't change, we can stop it. But the attackers are obviously much smarter than that. They change their tactics. And so you have to have a way to understand what is unusual behavior in the network. So the other thing we talk about is how do we understand behavior and what's unusual behavior? So that collective defense and then behavioral analytics are the foundation of what we talk to companies about in terms of moving to the next level in terms of cybersecurity.
we'll come back to the collective defense and the stronger together point. But let's talk about the energy sector, because the energy sector has a lot of critical infrastructure. And I think it's important to get to understand what are the major threats to these critical infrastructure within the energy sector. And I also, maybe you could distinguish a little bit on the kind of the criminals and the, what you call it, both nation-state cybersecurity threats.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing to understand about critical infrastructure, and as it applies to, cyber conflict and those sorts of things, is that when we talk about defending our country, air, land, sea, it's the military that's on the front lines. But when you talk about critical infrastructure, it's the same in Norway as it is in the United States, that the private sector is responsible for defending that critical infrastructure. And the energy sector, there's no more critical infrastructure than the energy sector. That's the lifeblood of all of our countries. And so the first thing we have to understand is it is the private sector that's on the front lines of defending against these types of attacks. And I think there's two aspects you have to think about. There's the nation state attacks. Russia has demonstrated with their attacks against Ukraine that they are developing and using capabilities against the energy sector. We've seen that many times. We've seen a number of attempts in the United States to target our energy infrastructure. China is getting more aggressive at understanding how to target infrastructure. So at the strategic level, there's no doubt if conflict escalated that you would see attacks from the nation states. What we're seeing right now, and you've seen it in Norway with the famous attack against hydro. You've seen attacks on the healthcare sector about a year ago. I just saw an article a couple of days ago about a $10 million theft from a large investment fund in Norway, Norfund. And so those are all representative of criminal attacks. And there's a number of ways that they can go after the energy sector. One is like that most recent with Norfund, they call it business email compromise. Maybe they get to the chief financial officer's email and they try to get a false wire transfer. More typically, like you saw with Hydro, it's ransomware or extortion, where they've encrypted the data, and now they're in Hydro's case, I saw one estimates cost about $71 million US dollars to recover from that attack. In other cases, they're interested in the intellectual property. A lot of work in Norway on renewable energy and new sources of energy, smart grid technology. The Chinese, for example, and from a criminal aspect, are very interested in getting to that research and development work. So unfortunately, across the board, nation state, criminals, extortion, ransomware, theft of intellectual property, all of those are reasons that in the energy sector, you have to be particularly ready to deal with some very advanced threats.
Going back to, you say that the private sector kind of ends up in the front line of these cybersecurity threats. Would you say that how well are we prepared to kind of handle these current and future threats?
Yeah, well, it's kind of funny, and I don't know the Norwegian energy sector obviously as well, but I suspect there's a similar dynamic in that a lot of the underlying infrastructure is pretty old, right? And a lot of it was developed prior to the internet, if you will. But now you're seeing more and more work on smart grid technology, integrating so that you can balance power distribution, for example, be smarter about billing, whether it's consumer billing or billing as you distribute power. All of those things are contributing to make the energy sector even more vulnerable, because all of that is just a translation for we're going to connect it to the internet, right? And as soon as you do that, makes that entire sector more vulnerable. The second aspect of that is that, as I said, we tend to defend one company at a time. And the other thing is we tend to rely on or solely on techniques that we know fail, firewalls and antivirus and those sorts of things. And all of that can be easily bypassed, just like with the Hydro example. As soon as one user mistakenly clicks on the wrong email, then all of those defenses have been bypassed. So what we've got to do is we've got to we've got to have that foundational level of security. Certainly you need firewalls, certainly you need antivirus, those sorts of things, but we've got to take it to the next level. We've got to be able to understand when an attacker has gotten inside your network, and that you can very quickly determine, hey, they've stolen Ingvild's credentials. And even though it looks like a legitimate user, they're doing very unusual things. And that gets to this behavioral analysis. How do we understand when unusual things are going on? So foundational security is very important. And then the other aspect is we've got to go to the next level, because we can't afford what we see today, where an attacker may be in your network for 200 days before you find them. You have to find them very early.
Talking about the energy industry, it has a lot of suppliers, big ones and small ones, and you need to take care that you're cyber security compliant without a whole value chain. Could you elaborate a little bit on how that is a threat?
Yes, and that's a great point, Ingvild. The example I usually give with that is the U.S. defense industry. Back in about 2007 or 8, we had a number of our very large defense companies were hacked. And so they put a lot of money into securing themselves, but they have a lot of partners. They have a lot of suppliers, and they rely on those suppliers. And so what the bad guys figured out was those smaller suppliers, those people down the supply chain, they are much easier targets. They don't have the same resources that the big company does. And the same applies 100% in the energy sector. A large energy company, no doubt, has hundreds of suppliers. It's got hundreds of different components. It gets probably from all over the world. And some of those components are going to be absolutely essential and critical to the functioning of that company. So not only do we have to be able to look across a sector where all of the big energy companies are working together, each of those companies also wants to have a collective defense approach that looks down that supply chain, that gives them visibility to where they may see an attack is starting to develop. Someone's hoping to get into one of those suppliers, and that can hurt you in two ways. One, that supplier may have connections into your network, which would allow them a route that would bypass all those defenses. Or number two, if that small company was subject to a ransomware or an extortion attack similar to what Hydro saw or Maersk saw, then they may not be able to produce that absolutely critical component or provide that absolutely critical service that that large energy company needs. So having visibility across your supply chain or your value chain, as you put it, I think is absolutely necessary.
I very much agree with you. But going back to, you say this is a collective defense. Could you elaborate a little bit more what you meant? Because I think this is actually underlining the main questions, the main question about this value chain, and they all lead to kind of collaborate to defend ourselves better. Could you elaborate a little bit on this?
Yeah, I'll talk two levels. One challenge we have seen is that it depends on the sector. What we've seen in the US anyway is the energy sector is very open to collaboration with other energy companies. They know there's some risk, there's obviously competition there, but they see much more value in being able to collaborate and being able to see that, oh, this energy company over here, there was maybe an attempted attack. Even if it wasn't successful, I would still like to know about that so I can understand what was the nature of that attack so that I can make sure I'm prepared for it. It's interesting, when you go to the financial sector, sometimes they aren't as interested in partnering because there's so much competition there that they don't see as much benefit from the sharing as they do from protecting themselves. So that's one challenge culturally we have to get over. The second challenge we have to get over is the issue of public and private partnerships. In the US, for example, liability is a huge concern for companies. If they share information with the government, what kind of liability concerns may that bring based on the information they share, or the fact that maybe they have to share that they weren't completely compliant with a particular standard? Does that open them up to various types of oversight or regulation, those sorts of things? So those are some cultural issues. And when we talk about collective defense for IronNet, there's three components. Very quickly, one is threat sharing. We want to share threat information, which is a common term in cybersecurity. The challenge is a lot of times we just share all the information. When we approach collective defense, we want to get very specific and share information that everybody in that collective defense arrangement is interested in, based on where they're located, what their business sector is, those sorts of things. The second thing collective defense does for you is we're all short on cybersecurity talent. So if we can all look at the same alerts, if we have the same data, if we have the same platform to work from, then we can start sharing that skill. So maybe there's 25 alerts that day in your collective defense dome, and so now you can start spreading those alerts around. This company maybe examines 10 or 12 of them. This company does 6 or 7. So sharing that talent. And then the third one is what we've talked about several times. It's just the visibility that you get by being able to see. We call it the attack surface, right? You're able to see not just who's after your company, but who's after similar companies or who's after your supply chain. So collective defense, the threat information sharing, the ability to collaborate or crowdsource your security talent, and then number 3, that visibility.
Mm-hmm. So sharing is caring also within cybersecurity.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
But you mentioned, you describe a situation where we can say that many companies are a bit reactive instead of being proactive when it comes to defensive measures. How would you say that new technologies, artificial intelligence, machine learning, kind of analytics of the behavior analytics, could you explain how this can help in the future to defend even better?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. Most defenses are reactive. I have one of my devices gives me an alert that someone breached my perimeter like yesterday, but I have no way of understanding where did they go, what data went out, those sorts of things. So being able to employ behavioral analytics that are looking at, a very simple example is, these two computers normally talk to each other only during the business day. Why are they talking to each other at 11:30 at night? Or Ingvild's credentials. Ingvild normally only accesses human relations data. Why is she now over in the OT network? And it's not actually you, but it's your credentials, right? But you look like a legitimate user, and most people don't have a way to see that there's unusual activity. But it's actually more complicated than that, because these days, the hackers don't have to have really sophisticated tools and have found, that one flaw in the operating system. Once they can get into a network using compromised credentials, that sort of thing, then they use normal protocols, normal services, normal communications, but they use them in unusual ways. And so your behavioral analytics have to identify those. But now getting to the artificial intelligence and machine learning, what we're doing is we're finding unusual activity, things that have changed in the network. But think about it. A network changes all the time, right? So we have an expression in the US about finding a needle in a haystack. I don't know if you're familiar with that in Norway, but when we're talking about finding malicious activity using behavioral analytics, it's more like finding the right needle in a stack of needles. It's very hard to find. In one case, this particular activity is very normal. Oh, but now it is subtly different. And so that's where we've applied artificial intelligence and machine learning, because you'll get 1,000 alerts. Some of our domes, we get millions of alerts over the course of a week. So you have to be able to apply this machine learning and artificial intelligence to sort through those and try to find the ones that are most likely to be something that you care about. Now, I'll tell you the other side of that is, there's no winning this game. The bad guys are figuring out how to use artificial intelligence and machine learning and how to bypass those systems at the same rate we're employing them. So it's always going to be a battle keeping ahead of the attackers.
I like the expression that there are no winners in this game. I need to ask you one more question, because the reason we are at home office, we are in the Corona situation, and all businesses that were able to go digital have gone digital, and we are all communicating digitally. What could this have to say for the cyber security threats?
Right. Well, what it does is, again, remember I used that term attack surface earlier. Think of your attack surface as, what is the area that makes you vulnerable to an attacker? And so by now, everybody going home and working, whether we're using your particular streaming service right now, but now everybody is communicating over these virtual streaming services. Many of us are using our personal devices now. And so now all of those things are not under the control of your IT people like they were before. So we've opened up a huge set of vulnerabilities that we didn't have before. The companies that were ready for this are companies, I think, that already had workers remote. They had thought about things like virtual private networks. They'd thought about bandwidth issues, all of those things. We were fortunate with our company. We had a very forward-looking chief information officer who had run a number of exercises, not looking at a pandemic, but looking at other disruptions to business. So we were prepared to do that. Other companies haven't been, but it just increases the risk. And if we go back to what we said before, that the most common way for any company to be hacked in any way, whether they're after like healthcare data, as we saw in that one attack in Norway, or they're after false wire transfers or ransom or extortion, the number one way they're going to get in is getting someone to compromise their credentials. And so what we've done is we've just made that a lot easier on the bad guys. So companies have to think, I think, going forward, how we're going to be able to deal with this new normal. In fact, I've stopped calling it the new normal. It's going to be normal for a lot of companies. And so you have to be moving forward on this pretty quickly.
Last question of the day. We call this talk 100% cyber secure. Is it utopia? What would you say?
There is no such thing as 100% security. It's interesting. I was on a webinar yesterday, and one of the gentlemen on there had written a book called Cyber Conflict. And what he had done is gone back to essentially the beginnings of the internet. And to listen to him talk, his name is Jason Healy. He's written a couple of interesting books, but to listen to him talk, he'll pull out quotes that you think were made yesterday, and they're quotes from 40 years ago. He had a quote from a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force talking about how the attackers always have the advantage, right? The attacker only has to be successful once. So 1 out of 100, I'm a successful attacker. The defender has to be successful 100 out of 100 times. And that quote was from 1979. So the same dynamic has been consistent. It's cheaper to be an attacker. Attribution's difficult. You only have to be successful one time. And I'll tell you what, Ingvild, the attackers are working together, right? You can go out and you can buy all sorts of tools. You can hire all sorts of expertise. So think of that as collective offense. The only way we're going to even keep up is collective defense. But as we talked about with artificial intelligence and machine learning, for every step we take to better defend ourselves, the attackers are going to be right with us and maybe a step ahead. So this is not something we can win. There's no magic box that will keep the criminal out, will keep the Russians out, will keep the Chinese out, whatever. There's no single magic box. It really boils down to leadership and company culture. Do you see cybersecurity as one of your strategic business risks? It's not the most important, but of the top 4 or 5 things you're worried about every day, cyber risk needs to be one of those that's certainly on the agenda of the C-suite and the board of directors.
So I think we've heard that the energy industry is in the front line of the cybersecurity threats. We've heard that you need to watch your whole value chain, including your employees, and that collaboration is actually the strongest strategy to overcome this threat. General Williams, thank you very, very much for joining us. It's a great pleasure having you with us. And also thank you to the ONS listeners.
Thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing you in person in 2021, hopefully.
Yeah, see you.
All right, bye-bye. Stay safe.